to the Pharma and Biotech Thought Leadership Podcast. I'm here today with Geoff Morrow and Kaustav Chatterjee from Merus Labs. Today we're talking about the art of the deal, business development, product acquisition, and licensing. Geoff and Kaustav, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
Thank you, Shanna.
Great. Why don't we start off by just having you tell our listeners a little bit about yourselves. Geoff, why don't you start first?
Sure, Shanna. I'm Geoff Morrow. I'm Vice President of Business Development at Merus. I have essentially over 20 years of pharma experience. I've worked in many pharma companies in a myriad of positions, including local and global commercial operations for companies like Eli Lilly and AstraZeneca. I joined Merus 2 years ago, and it's just been a whirlwind working for a small company over that time. So thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. All right, and Kaustav, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure, Shanna, thank you. So my background isn't as extensive as Geoff's, having many years in the pharma industry. So I've been with Merus for about 2 years, since October 2014. I'm the Director of Business Development here. So I've been with the company for just over 2 years now, and in this role I'm responsible for driving international business development, co-leading sourcing, due diligence, evaluations, and negotiations with Geoff. It's just in the last 2 years, it's been a whirlwind ride. As Geoff has mentioned, we've acquired 9 products in the last year and a half, which have doubled our sales, transformed our infrastructure in Europe, and significantly strengthened our cash flows. So prior to this, I've had about 8 years of life science startup experience, with about 6 years in academic research, including a master's in immunology, 2 years leading business development activities at Abi Health, which is a Toronto-based genotyping service, and an MBA in entrepreneurial finance at University of Toronto, with a focus on health and life science.
It's fantastic. I know when I was talking with Geoff Kaustav, he was saying that when it comes to business development, you are just a natural at this. That's something that he puts you on a pedestal and says, you are the guy.
That's very kind, yeah.
Can you tell, for our listeners who aren't as familiar with Merus Labs, can you please tell us what you do, what you specialize in, and what you're known for?
Yeah, absolutely. Merus is a publicly traded company. We're traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange as well as NASDAQ. In fact, I think a year ago we were one of the most actively traded stocks on the TSX. We are in the sector called spec pharma or specialty pharma, and what specialty pharma means is really companies that would like to grow by acquisition or licensing. So we don't have any of the clinical development that big pharma does, and all the R&D that companies like Pfizer have. So we're in a very specific subsector. There's companies like you may be familiar with, like Paladin, Concordia, Cipher, and of course Valiant. Everybody knows Valiant. We're all in that segment called spec pharma. So it makes us very unique. And what that model entails for spec pharma also is outsourcing. An outsourcing model. So our regulatory, our medical information, our promotional efforts, our distribution, our manufacturing is all outsourced. So what Merus does is we essentially acquire products from other companies or license them. And historically what we've done is we've acquired those products and taken those products and moved them from companies like Novartis to Merus. Through what we call an integration. So we integrate the product into our business. It may be manufacturing integration, distribution integration, promotional integration. So we typically took products that were neglected in the past by big pharma and basically breathed new life into those products. So in the past 26 months, as Kaustav mentioned, we've grown substantially. We've gone from 2 to 12 products. We've gone from 30 to over 100 million in sales. We operate now in 36 countries. There's 17, and we've grown our employee base to 22 from 5 just in 2 years.
That's incredible, and that kind of growth, I'm sure, really takes a lot of strategy. So, how did you go about sourcing those products and closing those products and having that success?
Mm-hmm. Sure, I can speak to that, Shanna.
Great, thanks, Kaustav.
Yeah, sure. So, as Geoff mentioned, we've had sort of a transformational last 2 years, and essentially, we started off about 5 years ago with the idea of really building a platform in Canada and Europe through the acquisition of legacy assets. And Geoff mentioned that in great detail. This is sort of the foundational phase of the company, and it allowed us to build an appropriate infrastructure in Europe and also build a steady stream of cash flows. So now we're at sort of a crossroads where we believe we're at the tail end of that foundational phase and are entering what we call a growth phase. So this entails sourcing growth assets through acquisitions and more likely in-licensing deals with obviously a focus in Europe because that's where we've built our infrastructure mostly. And we would like to obviously continue to build there to leverage this infrastructure. So, as you mentioned, there's quite a bit of active hunting, and there's a strategy behind these growth acquisition sourcing, and that requires a fair bit of active hunting. Geoff and I are on a flight to Europe and to the U.S. quite frequently, 3 or 4 times a year, talking to people, going to partnering conferences. We're talking to a lot of brokers as well, and it's a very dynamic process.
Can
And
you paint a picture for us? So let's imagine, here I am, and I'm a smaller, or no, I don't even have to be a smaller pharma company, but just a pharma company that's looking to acquire new products. Where would I start?
Well, I think the first thing you really need to do is identify what your selection criteria are. Every pharma is going to be different. You have to figure out what your territories are going to be, what your peak sales thresholds are going to be, what your balance sheet looks like right now, your strength and the ability to finance these deals. And also, what your risk appetite is for these kinds of assets, right? And whether you're looking at OTC products or prescription pharmaceuticals, you have to get those things right. And it's not an easy process. It's a very iterative process, and you need to engage senior management, the board, and it takes months and months to really pinpoint where your true strength would lie in these acquisitions or in licensing.
Now, do you typically say to another company, hey, you have this product and we're interested in licensing it or acquiring it? Or do other companies say, hey, we have these products and we're considering letting them go? Or does it work both ways?
It really depends on the phase. I think with legacy assets, it's more likely that they will come to you either directly or through brokers. Coming to you directly also requires a little bit of work because you have to establish those relationships with the BD folk at the divesting entity. With growth assets, however, it's quite a bit more dynamic. You really have to go out there and hunt. You've got to talk to as many people as possible. You've got to be in the know. So you've got to go to a lot of partnering conferences. You've got to make sure that your competitive mindset and kind of your intelligence of what the new technologies are is sound, so that when you do enter due diligence, you're kind of aware of what's going to hit the market, not only in the next couple of years, but over the term of the licensing deal as well.
So what sort of strategic thinking or strategy do you recommend that people consider when they're determining which products they would want to acquire or license or source?
Well, as Kaustav did mention, we're very focused with a specific criteria in mind, and that really informs our strategy. We're targeting assets that are essentially been submitted or approved in a single market. So at least it has some sort of track record. So we can look at the previous track record of the product. For instance, it may be just commercialized by a company in the US, and they don't have any commercial presence in Europe. So we like products with some sort of track record. We also like products that have a very concentrated subscriber or prescriber base. So we're not interested in GPs. We're a small company. We don't have that infrastructure, or nor we want to have that infrastructure to promote to GPs. So we're looking at very specific, specialized products with a concentrated prescriber base, like oncologists or like urologists or like neurologists. Also, too, we do have a existing platform in Europe. We have we have a regulatory infrastructure. We have a commercial infrastructure. All our commercial and regulatory is run out of our offices in Europe, and we have the supply chain infrastructure. So what we can do is when we're getting these new assets, we can somewhat leverage that platform. We want to make sure that those assets make a nice fit to our European commercial and regulatory team over there. And also too, we're looking at products with a certain threshold of peak sales. So we want products to at least, have the potential to exceed 25 million euros in Europe. So those are kind of the strategic criteria. And I urge the listeners to make sure that they have a firm sense of what they're looking for first before going to hunt for those assets.
Great. So just to recap, they'll want to look at things like the therapeutic area and so that they're being thoughtful about, it could be making sure that they're acquiring products where they don't have to bring in a completely new sales force. They'll want to look to see if the product itself has been launched successfully in at least one market. And they may consider launching it in another. And then the third thing that you mentioned that the companies will have to look at is risk tolerance. What's their risk tolerance for the product? And then the fourth thing you mentioned is just the overall budget. Can they afford to license or acquire that product? And then lastly, you mentioned it really is about creating a network with other people who work in pharma companies and people who work in business development, and meet these people at various conferences and events so that you can get in the know and really hit an opportunity at the right time. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, terrific. What are some of the challenges in the field of business development? Because I have to imagine that this could be a field where it's super exciting at times, and then there are probably times where you think something's going to close, and it's like the ninth inning of a baseball game, and all of a sudden it doesn't go the way you expect it to go.
Yes, I mean, there are transactional challenges for sure, which are going to be common to any company that sort of grows by acquisition or through in-licensing or even out-licensing. I'll speak to a little bit more on the earlier phase of these kinds of deals. One of the things that we're finding is a big challenge with growth assets is actually finding the perfect assets that would fit our selection criteria and really leverage our infrastructure in Europe. And the challenge there is, as we've mentioned, we really have to hit the road and talk to as many people as possible. Just make sure that we're not missing opportunities, right? So we're, and also we want to look at assets that are in a specific niche so that we're preventing competition with larger pharmaceutical companies where we really have no leverage whatsoever. So finding that perfect sort of diamond in the rough is definitely challenging, and you kind of have to keep a very healthy pipeline going at all times, which requires time management skills as well, obviously. But that's with growth assets, and we're still looking at legacy assets, and there are challenges with sourcing those deals as well. Obviously, when you're a smaller company and you're trying to get the attention of a larger pharmaceutical company that's divesting either a single product or a business unit or a portfolio, it's tricky to get their attention and to get them to take you seriously. So there's a lot of sort of massaging and softening in the earlier phases to get them comfortable with your business model and the fact that you're serious acquirers or in-licensors. And then I think once you do a good job of that, and that needs to be aligned throughout the entire corporation, not just with the BD team, but once that work is done, you get fruit really quickly once you plant those seeds. The other challenge that we have right now looking at growth assets compared to legacy assets is due diligence is very extensive for a growth asset. The benefit of legacy assets is, as Geoff mentioned, there's a track record that you can kind of benchmark against. You might have 5, 10, 15 decades of sales records to benchmark against. So you really know the business that you're acquiring when you're acquiring a legacy asset. With the growth asset, you might be lucky in that it might have been launched in a different territory. So there might be a track record, but in many cases there is no track record whatsoever. So there's a lot more uncertainty, and your risk tolerance has to be a lot higher. But as we're a public company, and to get our board on board and our investors on board, we have to do a significant amount of due diligence to arrive at a comfort level, a certain comfort level. So, due diligence is a lot longer. It's a lot more time consuming and expensive. But, we're building a very good knowledge base as well as we're looking at more and more growth assets. So the challenges come with rewards as well.
Great. I'm curious about how people get into the field of business development, because I'll often have people who have, say, for example, sales background in sales management, and they say, Shanna, I'd love to move into business development, and yet, while both are sales functions, they're completely a different kind of sales process. How do people move into this niche area?
Yeah, very, very good question. I mean, for Kaustav and I, we bring different, I guess, backgrounds. Kaustav's got a very, very solid financial background and scientific background, and I have a very strong commercial background. So I fell into BD through a commercial leadership role. Years ago, I worked at Astellas. And Cells was starting up a BD operation in Canada, and I moved into that role from a quite an extensive commercial background. And then, Kaustav can talk about many folks in finance that have a very strong interest in pharmaceuticals roll into business development from the finance end.
So would it be fair to say, Geoff, that if somebody was working on the commercial side and they wanted to move into business development, that the best thing that they could do is then say to the executive team, hey, this is something that I'm interested in. This is what I want to do in the future.
Yes, exactly. And the value that a commercial background would mean is because you're looking at all these different assets, and you know how the class of medications performs in the marketplace, and brings a very solid background when you're in front of the partners, and you have to have a certain knowledge base to be able to talk about the therapeutic area, the market potential for the product, the headcount requirements needed to successfully launch a new product.
Great.
And if I could just add, one thing there, and I think Geoff hit the nail on the head there. Business development is a very dynamic role, and when you're working for a smaller company, I think you could come from a variety of backgrounds, whether it be commercial, finance, supply chain and operations, regulatory, but as long as you're kind of willing to put on multiple hats and really look at all aspects of the business and understand that it's a very dynamic role. If you have that kind of ambition, I think anyone can really succeed at business development.
The last 3 deals that you've done at Merus are really impressive. Can you tell us about those?
Sure, absolutely, Shanna. I mean, both all these 3 deals, which were done in essentially the last 18 months, were built from the ground up. We essentially got the opportunity in front of us through various sources. And we basically negotiated these deals, did all the due diligence, and executed the agreement. So they're very interesting because we're dealing with companies at the global level. So we bought a package of cardiovascular products called the nitrates from UCB out of Brussels. We bought a women's health bundle of women's health products from Sanofi in Paris. We're actually negotiating those 2 deals at the exact same time. So Kaustav and I were essentially commuting to Brussels and Paris over quite a long period of time. And then prior to that was we bought oncology support and women's health product from Novartis. So those are basically those deals in the last 18 months. The values of those deals are all publicly available. They're on our website and our press releases. But it's just one thing to highlight. It's completely different dealing with different organizations. They all behave so differently. We had done previous deals with Novartis before my time and Kaustav's time, and so we already had a great history there. Their agreements already negotiated. So in fact, we from the time we signed the confidentiality agreement to the time we signed the deal was 90 days. So that deal was very, very quick and seamless, actually. And with Sanofi and UCB, big differences in the way they do business development, and you really have to fit your leadership style and your negotiation style to the partners that you're dealing with, because there's corporate differences and cultural differences as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very great trip. So of these 3 deals, basically 2 of them, the last ones, Sanofi and UCB, which we closed at the start of the year, our team in Europe right now is integrating those from UCB and Sanofi to Merus. So.
Oh, congratulations. I know those are 3 really big wins. Mm-hmm. So my hat's off to both of you. It's fantastic.
Thank you, Shanna.
So what is the future for Merus Labs?
It's very bright. In fact, Merus is Latin for to sparkle or shine. So it's a very bright future for us. We've told the board, that our plan is to continue hunting for assets. We, of course, have to continue to integrate them to make sure that's done as smoothly and as quickly as possible. And we also want to grow organically. So those 2 things, really, we want to be, our vision is to be the pan-European and Canadian leader in small and mid-sized specialty medicines by being nimble and entrepreneurial. So we think if we can stay nimble and entrepreneurial, the deal integration and the deal process can go very, very quickly, and we can grow, to our potential.
Nimble and entrepreneurial, that's a great strategy. Just in closing, if each of you could answer this question, what's the best piece of advice that you would give to someone in the field of business development from all of your experience and the things that you've learned? Mm-hmm. If people were to just focus on one thing, what do you recommend? And I'll have each of you answer that.
Sure, I'll take the start on that one. I think one piece of advice I can give somebody that's in business development is really to expand your network as broadly as possible through vehicles like LinkedIn, through meetings. Get yourself known, get the company known. So even if the partner is not divesting, they may know somebody that is, or they may do so in the future. And then, if you have a great relationship and a very large range of relationships and network, you're more likely to be called when companies are doing a divestment. So,
mm-hmm.
Great. And Kaustav?
Yeah, thanks, Shanna. Great point, Geoff. I think that's really key. I guess I have a couple of points.
Sure.
One is really, when you have a BD strategy that affects the entire organization, it's critical to get alignment with the entire organization and make sure that your organization understands what the BD team does and understands what the strategy means for their day-to-day operations. And the second piece of advice I would give, and it's common sense, but sometimes it's overlooked. It's, never get attached to a deal. With on the BD side, we some of these deals are very close to us and we put a lot of time and effort into them, but the nature of business development is dynamic. So, you'll find that you've got a very healthy pipeline. You may proceed on 3 or 4 or 5 of them in a year, but you may only close 2 or 3 of them in a year. That's the nature of the business. And, it's very dangerous to get attached to a deal.
Kaustav and Geoff, it's just been really fantastic speaking with you. Thank you for being guests on the Pharma and Biotech Thought Leadership Podcast. You've given a lot for our listeners to think about, and it's been really, truly valuable. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for the opportunity, Shanna.
Yeah, thanks, Shanna. It was our pleasure.
You've been listening to the Pharma and Biotech Thought Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Shanna Landalt. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today. If you've liked what you've heard, please go on to iTunes and give us an honest rating. Or if you've watched this video, please share this video with your friends and your colleagues. It's been wonderful to bring thought leadership to you. I'm your host again, Shanna Landalt, and you've been listening to the Pharma and Biotech Thought Leadership Podcast.
Hi, it's Shanna Landalt again. I do have an epilogue to this podcast. Since we originally filmed the podcast, Merus has been acquired by Norgine BV, which should be seen as a great outcome since it really was the culmination of a lot of great work done by the entire Merus team over the years. Congratulations to everyone at Merus.